Welcome to Making Links Radio, Radio with a Social Conscience, and to our special program on supporting Emphasis 2024 CFCR 90.5 FM Community Radio. Making Links has been a sponsor and a participant for many, many years on CFCR 90.5 FM, almost 3 decades, in fact. We thank you for your continuing support. To make a donation to keep good community radio going, phone 306-664-6678 or go to more information at cfcr.ca, and you'll see the various activities that are linked to Emphasis. And we really appreciate your donation. Thank you. Bye-bye. The Earth is Burning is our special program today and its impact on Saskatchewan with noted environmentalist Peter Prebble. In our introduction to this program, we asked Peter Prebble if he was Premier of Saskatchewan to outline the steps he would take immediately to make sure Saskatchewan becomes a low-emission economy and society. If you're the Premier of the province and you realize then that, the Earth is burning and there's all these various things happening that you've been explaining, how would you do an emergency recovery? If you had the resources to say, we've got to stop this right now, it's gone over the edge, and as a Premier of the province, how would you put it forward in terms of what should be done?
Well, I think I'd begin by winding down our coal-fired power plants as rapidly as possible. And essentially, in the summertime, we could operate a lot of the time without coal if we deployed made a major investment in renewable energy. So I would invest in 5,000 new megawatts of wind and solar power in this province, and I would import more hydro from Manitoba, and I would invest very heavily in electricity conservation, with the view to achieving 300 or 400 megawatts of electricity reductions through just wise efficiency and conservation measures. And that combination would allow us to close down most of our coal-fired power plants in the next 6 or 7 years. And I would keep them running as a kind of a backup in the winter in case we get into circumstances where we have big cold snaps and we need them, but I wouldn't run them on a year-round basis anymore. So that's one of the things that I do. A second thing I do is I'd introduce those really, I'd introduce very tough methane regulations on the oil and gas industry, and I'd seek to cut methane emissions by at least 75% by 2030. So that would be another big area to tackle. I'd create, with a cleaner electricity grid, Don, you can then do a lot of other things in Saskatchewan. And one of them is that we could move towards a lot more use of electric vehicles, and we could have electric vehicles charging stations that are charged with solar power, and we could have provincial incentives for people to move to very energy efficient vehicles, hybrid vehicles, electric cars and trucks. Provincial incentives combined with the federal incentives that are now in place could make this a lot more attractive for people in Saskatchewan. And so we could cut our emissions in the transport sector, I think, very significantly over a 7 or 8 year period. But having a clean grid is absolutely key to doing that, because of course there's no point in running our electric vehicles on a grid that's being powered by coal. And
Peter, I wanted to start our discussion with one of the things that you wrote, which is that climate change is a public health emergency. Do you want to get into that a little bit more? And I know you've written some really good information lately that helps us to really understand the reality of what's going on with Earth right now. I like to call it Mother Earth,
right,
because that's the way it should be treated. So do you want to just get into that a little bit about the commentaries? And I know you have key other points that you would talk about too, but I know our listeners would really be appreciative of what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think public health is now at risk from climate change, and different parts of the world are experiencing different impacts. Here in Saskatchewan, probably the biggest health impact we're experiencing right now is just wildfire smoke and all the risks that are associated with it, not just respiratory risks, but also risks of increased dementia, and for children who have asthma, this creates breathing problems. The reality is that, some of the chemicals in wildfire smoke can penetrate the brain barrier. So it's really very concerning that we're getting as much exposure as we are. And we've now had, years in Saskatchewan where we've got 10, 12, 13 days of where there's significant wildfire smoke in the air. And the reality is that, wildfires are now a major risk in Canada. In 2023, we had 18.5 million hectares of forest that burned in the country. So people all over North America were being exposed to the wildfire smoke. Many other parts of the world, the risks are quite different. In many cases, insect-bearing diseases are spreading at alarming rates. And things like dengue fever are rapidly on the rise in many parts of the world. And I think one thing that's being experienced by the majority of the world's population right now is a growing number of heat deaths from climate change. In Saskatchewan, we swelter when temperatures are in the mid-30s. We had 10 countries in 2024 so far that have experienced temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius. And these are all countries where the majority of people don't have air conditioning. So that has devastating consequences for public health. And a lot of heat deaths are not recorded in poorer parts of the world. They're not diagnosed as heat deaths, but a lot of people are working, outside in manual labor at temperatures in the mid-40s, the high 40s, in some cases over 50 degrees Celsius. That's very, very dangerous in terms of risk of organ failure, risk of liver damage, kidney damage. So heat deaths are on the rise, and they will rise very rapidly if we don't take global action to reduce man-made greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, we need to stop burning fossil fuels, we need to stop deforestation, and we need to rapidly move to create a net zero greenhouse gas emission future in the world. And if we don't, we're going to see climate change become a public health emergency on multiple fronts.
When you think about the public health emergency, it's so real in what you're putting forward. But in this province, we have a government that looks the other way. What's the logic of what's going on here?
Well, I mean, we have a government that has made a priority of protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And of course, also a government that receives significant donations from the fossil fuel industry. And so I think the priority of the current provincial government has been to focus on growing the economy and turning a blind eye to the consequences of climate change. So, for instance, this government is very willing to expand the oil industry at a time when the International Energy Agency and the United Nations are asking all governments to stop expanding their oil industries because it's simply unsustainable from the point of view of the climate crisis. The provincial government here has a target of expanding the oil industry another 25% by 2030. And so, that's a target that climate scientists are begging governments not to pursue. The Alberta government, of course, is doing the same thing. It's expanding its industry, knowing full well that climate scientists universally are calling on governments not to do this. And of course, it's not just Saskatchewan and Alberta. We're seeing the same. We're seeing many governments around the world do the same thing and essentially ignoring the advice of the international scientific community and ignoring the advice of our International Energy Agency, which is one of the most conservative bodies you could find. In terms of, it has a record of basically giving advice to governments on oil and gas policy. And it is saying, don't expand the industry. And the Saskatchewan government is not listening.
So draw a bridge to the federal government for us, because the federal government is sort of looked on in Saskatchewan as something you don't want to have here. Like, the relationships with the federal government should always be at a level of criticism, and we're not going to go and do what you want us to do. But the federal government obviously believes in something in terms of climate change happening. They go to the international conferences. What's going on there between Saskatchewan and Alberta and Ottawa?
Well, I think in the case of Saskatchewan's not even participating in a lot of the regional tables where consultations are happening with respect to climate policy. Saskatchewan has basically opted out, and I think that's a very foolish decision, because the federal government is trying to shape policies that take account of provincial interests and provincial concerns, and Saskatchewan is not cooperating in any way. But I think the federal government, has pursued better climate change policies, in fairness, than any other government previously. I mean, and I've got lots of criticism of federal government climate policy, but I mean, there is a price that's been put on carbon pollution, to the credit of the federal government, and they've stuck by their guns despite all the criticism from provinces. But, does it really make sense not to put a price on a source of pollution that is actually threatening the future of human civilization? Doesn't it make sense to have a price on carbon? So I'm so disappointed that both the current provincial government and the official opposition are opposing that, and the federal government has also said, listen, we need to get control of methane emissions in the oil and gas industry, and methane is probably, reducing methane is the most impactful way in the short term that we can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the world, because methane has a very short atmospheric lifetime compared to carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, which are the other two big greenhouse gas pollutants. Methane's lifetime in the atmosphere is only 12 years, whereas the average life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, once it's, say, released from a coal-fired power plant, is 100 years. The average lifetime of nitrous oxide, if it's released, say, from the running of automobiles or that coal-fired power plant, is 112 years. So in other words, we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to 1/100th of what they are now to stabilize the climate. We have to reduce nitrous oxide emissions to 1/112th of what they are now to stabilize the climate. Whereas with respect to the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere, is just between 12 and 14 years. So in other words, if we can reduce methane emissions sharply, we can see a much more immediate result from our actions. And that's why the federal government is emphasizing this. And Saskatchewan is again not cooperating. Saskatchewan's government was essentially forced by the feds back in 2018, 2019 to take some initial steps to reduce methane emissions. The federal government introduced new regulations with that in mind, but it also said to Saskatchewan, you know what, you can come up with your own regulations if you want to, as long as the result is equivalent. And Saskatchewan chose to do that, and it achieved a cut in emissions. Now the federal government is saying we need to go a lot further and make the reduction a lot bigger, and Saskatchewan is basically saying, no, we're not taking part in that. And that is a very foolish move, because this is one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions. The methods of reducing them are very well established, and there's no burden on the average taxpayer from doing this. There's some cost associated with this for the oil and gas industry themselves, but they've been making big profits in the last few years. They can easily afford to do this. And Premier Moe's government is essentially, again, protecting them at a time when he should be paying a lot more attention to protecting the well-being and health of Saskatchewan people. So that just for instance, methane leaks from storage tanks, methane, the venting of methane into the atmosphere. These are things that are readily possible to stop, and and the Saskatchewan government should be enforcing the measures that make the oil and gas industry do these things. And inspectors should be going to sites and looking for elevated levels of methane and basically forcing companies to put a stop to these leaks into the atmosphere. This is, one of the problems we have in Saskatchewan is that we haven't taken efforts to even properly measure methane emissions into the atmosphere. And they're much, much higher than companies report. Last year, a team from Carleton University came to Saskatchewan. They looked at 962 oil wells in the Lloydminster area, and they found that the emissions of methane were 4 times higher than what were being reported by the companies and the government. So we've got a real problem with methane emissions in this province, and I completely support federal government requests for Saskatchewan to do a lot more to regulate them.
There seems to be here, though, a real gap on social responsibility and economic responsibility. We live on Mother Earth. Things just don't stop at the borders.
Of course.
How can this happen? I mean, you for a long time you were a member of the Legislative Assembly here. You saw how things worked there, but how could this go on with a government here that deliberately is putting into the atmosphere when it's going to kill people? Like what? I mean, knowing Saskatchewan as you do, what is happening there? Like, is there that they would be so heavy on the oil and gas? Now I understand that the oil corporations and the gas and all that have a strong lobby, so they must be putting a heavy lobby on this provincial government to keep out of that area and not work at all with any kind of way of dealing with healing the earth.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, there is a strong lobby, of course, and there's also the matter of generous donations from the oil industry to the current Saskatchewan party government. But there's also the reality that, of course, we benefit from the oil royalties that are collected. And I think people are very conscious of that. And there's a lot of jobs attached to the oil and gas industry in this province. Direct and indirect employment would be in the range of over 30,000 jobs. So this makes the transition, away from oil and gas more complicated in Saskatchewan, and this is the case in basically all the oil-producing countries of the world. I mean, everyone faces the same challenge, and that's why the transition needed to start years ago, and it needs to be gradual, and we need to look for, other alternative forms of employment. It's going to be the same when we phase out coal in this province. We need to phase out our coal-fired power plants. We're the only province in Canada that is refusing to do that by 2030. Every other province is cooperating. Coal is the most polluting of all the fossil fuels. And obviously when those plants are phased out, the people who work in them are going to need transitioning in terms of other employment opportunities. But the reality is, if we create a renewable energy future in this province, there are going to be a lot of new jobs associated with that kind of a future. And if we put a lot of emphasis on creating a more energy efficient economy and conserving energy, there are thousands of additional jobs that could be created that are associated with that. And so that's why the transition needs to start right away, because we don't want it to just, be an immediate cutoff. But we need to get going on a transition that will take us to a much lower emission economy, and by 2040, and we need to achieve some immediate cuts by 2030. And unfortunately, I don't see a lot of evidence from the provincial government that those cuts are coming. The international scientific community is basically saying to the world, listen, if you want to prevent catastrophic climate change, you need to cut your greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, natural gas.
Peter, this program is the first installment. We're going to do a second one, right? So I wanted to just finish this part with how do you build the bridge, urban-rural, rural-urban, so you can actually move it? How would you see the possibility of, because right now we are sitting in a split, and it appears that the government that's the government here right now rests on its sort of rural base to be able to just go ahead and do what it's doing. But from your perspective, as somebody again who's been in the legislative, you've helped to make and seen laws passed. How would you build the bridge to say this is a problem for all of us? It's not just an urban problem. It's not just a rural problem, and it's also obviously it's an international, worldwide problem.
It's a global problem.
Yeah. So how would you see that bridge being built?
Well, I think one of the keys to building the bridge is to get good information about science out to every resident of the province. The reality is in rural Saskatchewan, the impacts of climate change are being felt. In the last 3 years, the Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation has paid out $6 billion in insurance claims and benefits, largely because of extreme weather, particularly drought. And so we're being impacted by climate change in rural Saskatchewan, and the future of agriculture in the province could be in jeopardy by the end of the century if climate change is not dealt with. Like we'll face an emergency here in terms of agricultural production. Drought will just become so severe that there may be parts of the province that can't produce a decent crop anymore. So rural Saskatchewan is vulnerable. And in terms of building bridges, well, I think one of the ways to build bridges is to create new employment opportunities in rural Saskatchewan related to building a renewable energy future. The reality is, we've got such incredible solar potential, for instance, in this province. And there's no reason why the farming community and smaller towns and villages couldn't be benefiting from this in a huge way. And, I see that happening in some European countries. And I think there's huge opportunities to make that happen here. One of the things that the provincial government has foolishly done is they've changed the net metering program so that when you export solar electricity onto the grid, you only get paid half as much as you used to for it. And that has put a huge damper on solar energy taking off in rural Saskatchewan. And but there's no reason why thousands of farmers across this province couldn't have major solar installations on their land that would be contributing to the grid, that would be helping to create a clean electricity future, and that at the same time would be generating revenue for the local farm family. So that's just one example of bridge building.
Well, the bridge building is absolutely critical. When you look at what you've been talking about, and you look at the crises, the absolute world crises that we're in, and when people use words like earth burning, they mean it. Is there any way that government of Saskatchewan, other places in the world, including the corporations, the oil, that can be held accountable? Is there any kind of campaign that says, look, you got to stop this, and because you're destroying the earth? Now, I understand that the UN may have a link. Could you explain what it could possibly be that would be important to all of us as citizens of the world?
Well, one of the things that's happening in the world is that there's a lot of climate litigation cases now being made against corporations and against governments for lack of action on climate change, and to hold them accountable for the pollution that they're responsible for. In fact, there's 2,666 climate litigations going on in the world right now, most of which have been launched by not-for-profit organizations. And I think one of the really important things that's going to happen is that the International Court of Justice has been asked by the United Nations to rule on what are the obligations of states with respect to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent climate catastrophe. And what are the obligations of states in terms of compensating countries and parts of the world that are already being severely damaged? I mean, the reality is that, extreme weather events have risen 5-fold in the last 50 years as a result of climate change. So the duration, the frequency, the intensity of these events is growing steadily, and a lot of people are suffering as a result of that. There's 20,000 children a day in the world that are being displaced by extreme weather events now, which is a horrifying thought in itself. And there's all this environmental damage that is directly impacting, human beings. For instance, like the biomass of corals in the world has been cut in half as a result of the ocean becoming hotter and all these major marine heat waves that are taking place, caused again by increased greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so the ocean is heating up. It's absorbing 90% of the heat that's being generated by our carbon and methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And 500 million people in the world rely on those reefs as part of their food security. So, I mean, the Great Barrier Reef is a great risk in Australia, but reefs are at risk all around the world, and millions of them died in the last 2 or 3 years as a result of a warmer ocean. So what is Saskatchewan's responsibility with respect to all of this? Well, one of the things that the International Court of Justice will rule on is, do parts of the world and people in the world who've been negatively impacted by all this in a major way deserve compensation from countries that are responsible for this pollution? And if in fact there's no mechanism that requires countries to pay, but if they do need to pay, we should think about the fact that Saskatchewan will owe billions and billions of dollars in compensation for its share of greenhouse gas pollution in the world, because trillions of dollars of damage are being created as a result of climate change. And our emissions are 9 times the world average. Just to put this in context, our greenhouse gas emissions in this province are 5-fold those of Nova Scotia with its 1,072,000 people. So the reality is that the Saskatchewan government and the Canadian government could be held responsible for, needing to compensate other parts of the world, not in the next few years, but if the International Climate Court of Justice rules that states have an obligation to pay, that will influence outcomes of many, many climate litigation cases around the world, and we should all think about that. It's just another reason why Saskatchewan needs to change course.
And I think there's an underlying obligation of citizens. Citizens should be obligated at whatever level they want to work at, community groups, churches, to follow up and support the International Court of Justice.
Yes, I think it's extremely important that that's done. And it's extremely important as we come to a provincial election for climate change to become a vote determining issue in this province. Health, education are clearly key, the well-being of our economy, but climate change needs to become a vote determining issue as well.
And this is our first part of our discussion. And in the second part, we'll move further into what could be done here. And also we'll move into how does Canada and Saskatchewan really work in alliances with other countries in the world, and what's happening in Africa and India. So we're looking forward to have that program with you as well.
Yeah.
And we'll catch up to you at that point. Yeah. Making Links has been a sponsor and a participant for many, many years on CFCR 90.5 FM. Almost 3 decades, in fact. We thank you for your continuing support. To make a donation to keep good community radio going, phone 306-664-6678 or go to more information at cfcr.ca. And you'll see the various activities that are linked to F-Emphasis. And we really appreciate your donation. Thank you. Bye-bye.